base is dropped on a new edition of Soccer Down here. It's May 4th. It's a Monday. We don't have a catchy hashtag because we're trying not to overreact on Mondays these days. Trying not to overreact in general because that's where everything is these days. We do have updates on England and pretty much every level of England and what they're looking at going forward as they try to get back on the field. We've got a little bit of controversy in Italy on the political front. We've got an update from Scotland. But, John, I think we have to start with the U.S. women's national team and something that caught a lot of people by surprise when it was announced late last week.
Yeah, referencing the Jane McManus article out of the New York Daily News. And basically, Judge R. Gary Klausner of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California has handed according to McManus, handed the U.S. Soccer Federation a partial win when he agreed that the U.S. women's national team had been paid more relative to the men and that the women's complaint stemmed from their own unwillingness to accept a deal that paid them more per game, a deal like the men had. And then Molly Levinson, women's national team spokesperson, and also there were a lot of players from the women's national team side who came out on Twitter. Quote, "We're shocked and disappointed with today's decision, but we will not give up our hard work for equal pay."
There's a lot of things that make this really complicated.
Yes.
And we've talked about it along the way. I really wondered how the judge would look at this. The women got a salary and the men did not. That is one huge difference in the way that they were compensated. And that does factor into this decision. It was considered part of their compensation, as it should be. I mean, it is. It was just, as we said when you had the change in leadership at U.S. Soccer and there was talk about getting back to the table and figuring out next steps, I've always felt like they need to figure out whatever the amount is that compensation will be and sit down with the men and the women, and it should be equal. That's for sure. And if there's a difference because of the number of games played, that's a different conversation. The compensation should be equalized. And once you get the overall amount of compensation for whatever period you're talking about, if it's yearly, if it's cycle, whatever, then have the discussion about how you want to divide it up. Because the women are in a different situation. I think we all know that. If you compare the salary of a Christian Pulisic, to a Mallory Pugh, for example, we're talking very different things at their club level. The Federation doesn't have anything to do with what is paid out at the club level. It's not their purview. It has nothing to do with them. The men don't need a salary because even guys breaking through are getting a steady paycheck, and a pretty good-sized one, even players who are just emerging, at the club game. That's their bread and butter. The women, the salary at the club game is a very different conversation worldwide, and that's not just a U.S. thing, but it's definitely an issue here. Where you take an established player who can go to Europe, okay, but players who are breaking into the NWSL and breaking into the national team pool, well, it's a different world. That's what makes this a little more complicated. Now, what I hope happens out of this, because I did see some comments about how the Federation was in a no-win situation at this point. I do think Cindy Parlow-Cone will treat the women fairly because she played for the U.S. women's national team. I don't think she has any reason not to treat them fairly. It doesn't really make any sense. But you look at the Federation now, they win the court case. And they won the court case not on the ludicrous, awful argument that their previous legal representation put forward and that President Carlos Cordero didn't check, I guess, and that's what ultimately led to him stepping down. They didn't win on that, and that was where this started. I was worried that from a federation standpoint, they would win on that, but you're not winning anything because you're doing damage to the reputation and the relationship. And they did that damage. That damage is there, and that damage is something that the women's national team and the federation has to overcome. The judge didn't rule on that. The judge ruled on a couple of elements that, I mean, honestly, are kind of important here. First off, and this is something that's just a little baffling that it got to this point, and this didn't come up before. When you take the period of time that was being discussed and you break it down on a per game basis, the women were paid slightly more than the men. And it's hard to argue, unequal pay when that's the case over a 4-year period. Now, there's lots of different elements that can be argued within that, but that's a hard one to overcome. And it's in the statement. The argument was made on the women's side, and Stephen Bank, law professor at UCLA, had a pretty good breakdown on all of this. The women's national team argument was based on the per game and tournament bonuses being different for the women's national team and the men, and the women's national team would have received a larger payout if they had been playing under the men's national team deal. The problem with the second part, and look, I've seen it both ways. I've heard things myself that lead me to believe that the women chose to have salaries paid for their pool as opposed to the federation coming to them and saying, here are salaries for you. We're not going to do this for the men. This is what we're doing for you. There's back and forth about were the women offered the men's deal. And I don't know if that's the case. The judge seems to feel that they were, and they wanted the salary structure side of it. And if you do that, then, yeah, your bonuses and that side of it is going to be different because you're getting money up front that's not tied to a bonus. The men aren't getting that money up front. Everything is tied to per appearance and a bonus for performance. So it's a little hard to argue that when you're getting a steady paycheck. We don't know the thing about the deal. I have heard that it was something the women wanted was the salary and the extra benefits that they received in that to have more security as opposed to a per game, per tournament kind of deal. I guess the biggest thing that goes a step beyond that is the fact that they signed the CBA. And that probably didn't help their case either because it was agreed upon. And it's hard to agree to a contract and then come back and say the contract's unfair. It's a hard argument to make. There are still a few things that are still up for grabs in this about, I think, working conditions. There were things about turf, playing on turf. There were things about charter flights. These are things that are kind of no-brainers to me, and this is where the Federation just looks dumb. And they looked dumb when per diems were different. They looked dumb in terms of not having the same treatment when it comes to travel, charter flights, etc., playing on turf for friendlies. I mean, the game that was going to be at Aloha Stadium in Hawaii and the turf was unsafe, and they ended up not playing it. That's an absolute embarrassment. Things like that are not helping the Federation's case. But those are not tied to equal pay. That's equal working conditions. That's a different conversation, and it's one that absolutely should be brought up, and it's one that should be rectified, and there's no excuse for it. And that is why, now that you've gotten to this point, and yes, the Federation won the big part of it, the risk of having to make a big payout to the women's national team now is pretty low. But the Federation should not feel like they are the winners here and they shouldn't do anything about any of this. They need to sit down with both teams, the women and the men, and make an equal announcement on this. They need to equalize this, and they need to make the decision. I mean, honestly, I think to avoid issues, they're going to have to make this deal the same both ways. And that's going to change how the women are paid in a pretty big way. And I don't know if that's ultimately what they want, because they don't have the club money to fall back on. But if you want to avoid any appearances or any conversations about this and get into anything about bonuses aren't equal, et cetera, you're going to have to do the same deal both ways. And you're not going to pay the men a salary. That's not happening. So I don't know if ultimately it's going to end up being a better deal if you go down that way. Otherwise, if you do it in the way that we talked about a month or so ago, when I think Cindy Parlow-Cone took over, if you say we're going to pay you both the same amount over the lifetime of this agreement, and we're going to have the agreements run the same, we're going to pay you the same amounts. The men, we're not going to give you a salary. Don't even ask. Don't even go there. The women, if you want a salary, this is how we're going to have to figure it out. We're going to pay you the same amount, but you're going to get this up front instead of getting it in an appearance fee, instead of getting it in a bonus, et cetera, et cetera. And now the other element that I probably need a little more clarity on is the argument about the bonuses and the amounts paid out for winning the World Cup, et cetera, et cetera. There is a incredibly large element of that is outside of the Federation's hands. What FIFA awards to teams for making the World Cup, for making the round of 16, for advancing, for winning the thing, et cetera, it's nowhere near the same for the men and the women. And I don't know how a court would rule on the women making less than the men would have made out of a pot that is outside of the Federation that they can't control. That's a tricky one. And I don't know if it makes sense. I don't think it does. And that's just my opinion. If you want to argue with FIFA about how much they're paying out to the Women's World Cup teams, it's a very valid argument, and it's one that probably needs to be had. It needs to be increased. Is it the same as the men? Should it be the same as the men? It's nowhere near right now. Should it be closer? Yes. I think the Women's World Cup, this past one especially, has shown that it is a business and a good one, and the payouts should reflect that. But is it the same business as the Men's World Cup? I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure that it's not. And, in light of that, should the payout from revenue be the same? It'd be a bold move to do it. And if you want to just combine both of them and do the payouts together, and it's the same, it'd be a great move for FIFA to make. From a separate business standpoint, if you're comparing the two tournaments, it's not the same. I don't think it is. I don't think there's numbers to back that up. Could it be down the road? Maybe. But it's not right now. That is a FIFA argument. For that to be part of this argument about what the women are making from the Federation, and the men would have made more if they had won the World Cup versus the women making what they did for winning the World Cup, I think where the Federation has to be careful here is the percentages should be the same. If whatever that award was for the men, if it was 50% of what the award would be from FIFA, if the women got at least 50% of whatever award from FIFA that the Federation got, because the money goes to the Federation, then they pay it out based on how they want to. Different federations have different deals with their players. If the percentages were the same, I'd probably say that that's fair. That's a FIFA thing, and that's a bigger issue, and it's one that should be argued. I think those dollars need to go up. But the U.S. Federation doesn't control what FIFA pays them out. So that part of the bonus issue is a very different conversation. I think a lot of people reacted in a very emotional way when this was announced, and I get it. This is an emotional issue. But I think people didn't necessarily pay attention to the arguments and the details. And this has been part of my frustration with the way it has been portrayed, especially from the spokesperson for the case on the women's side. Because I feel like there's been a lot of shifting of what the argument is, and that doesn't help the case, period. Equal pay is an absolutely important case and issue to bring up. But it started shifting around from equal pay, and then you started looking at it, and it's like, well, it's pretty equal, and the numbers bore out that it was actually a little bit more per game on the women's side, to then it should be more than equal pay, and then that's a different argument, and then it just got very argumentative in areas that it didn't need to be, and it didn't help the situation. And what I hope now is that you've had the initial ruling. There are still things on the table. Those things should be easy to solve. Those things shouldn't have been there anyway. And the Federation should be hammered for them. Don't get me wrong. The Federation's 100% wrong in not having the two teams travel in the same way. Could there be some differences based off the tournaments and logistics? Sure. But to even give the appearance of not providing the same quality of travel to the women that you provided to the men is a horrible look from the Federation, and they should have known better. The stuff about turf and that, we've had this conversation. That's idiotic. You weren't going to have the men play on that turf in Hawaii. There's no way you should have even scheduled the women to. So now the Federation has to give to try to fix things. And I hope that the argument becomes more about, all right, how do we make it better going forward? How do we fix this going forward? They need to sit down in a room and come to an agreement and move forward. Because if this drags out and you have a court case on the smaller issues of it, that's only going to lead to more discontent. That's only going to lead to more, fractioning of the Federation and the national teams and the fan base. They need to fix it, and they need to find the right way forward. But the biggest question is going to come down to that whole issue of guaranteed salary for a smaller number of players, which puts limits on the national team pool, which means you're not calling players from outside the pool. Are you going to have that as part of this, or are you just going to do the same deal for both? No questions asked, no salary on the women's side. And then the argument or the case should be made on the women's side is, okay, you have supported us with salaries and security, in our national team work for the last whatever period of time since they negotiated salaries in. You have also supported the NWSL, and that's separate. And that could have been an argument that should have been included. That's separate from this. The argument would be that we are asking you, and as part of this deal, we want you to agree to continue to support the NWSL, continue to support salaries in the NWSL that are spread among the payrolls of the NWSL. And that would be a huge statement for the women's game as a whole. If you can make that argument from the women's side in this is, okay, we're going to take the same deal, so this is simple, this is easy, whatever. Same percentages of awards, of bonus money, same amount per game, same everything, across the board, done. But we're going to negotiate because the women's game needs it. And a lot of people have brought up the whole idea that the Federation is a nonprofit, and it is. and its job is to promote the sport in this country. This is where it gets to be a slippery slope, because when you get into that conversation, then it becomes basically making a case for why the nonprofit should pay out money, not talking about equal pay, but why they should support the NWSL over USL League One, or why they should support, this over that. And that's not an easy case to always make. I think they should. I think the NWSL needs that support. I think it needs that support to grow. I think it has the potential to get where it doesn't need that support. And when you're on the nonprofit side, that's the whole point of this. Because you can't prop something up forever with that money, because when you get into a situation like we're in now, and that money goes away, you don't want your money to be the only thing keeping that afloat. That was always an argument that came up in grant applications that I'd write from Soccer in the Streets. Funders didn't want to be the primary funder of something. They wanted to know that if they had to pull their funding for whatever reason, that your organization would continue to survive. The U.S. Federation needs to support the NWSL, but the case is because it can become self-sustaining, but it needs that help right now, and especially right now. It's definitely going to need that help. So it's a very complicated situation. I think a lot of people have boiled it down to, hashtags and phrases and a lot of screaming and yelling, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And my biggest surprise in this was the fact that when you broke down the money paid out, the women were getting a little bit more, not much more, not enough to be a huge conspiracy or to put a tinfoil hat on. But the women were getting slightly more per game played than the men did. I don't know why that didn't come up before, and I don't know why the case was structured and portrayed the way that it was when that was accurate. Now, if the argument was that the men would have gotten more if they had qualified for the World Cup, that's a tricky one, but there's maybe a little something to it. But that's not ever something that can be guaranteed. And that's another reason why this is difficult to compare, because the cycles don't line up. 15 was a Women's World Cup year. 16 was an Olympic year. It wasn't a good one on the women's side, but it was an Olympic year, so you had games around it, especially before it. The men did not qualify for 18, so 2018 was not the year that it would have been on the men's side in terms of the number of games and stuff. If they had qualified and they had gotten whatever World Cup appearance fee they would have gotten, you don't know where they would have finished and how much money they would have gotten. They didn't get there ultimately, so I don't think that you could have expected them to go very far. It would have likely been different. But that wasn't the case that was brought. The case that was brought was comparing, I think, 2015 to 2019 and the revenues that came in and what was paid out to both teams. That was maybe a bad legal strategy without thinking it through, or just not doing the homework, which I'd be blown away if that was the case. If that was the case, then if I'm the women's national team Players Association, I'm questioning my payment to my legal folks if this was the argument they made and they didn't do the math. I'm just a little blown away by that part of it, because that makes this a very difficult argument. It's a bad situation to begin with. The fact that we're talking about this morning is not good. And the Federation has to change the way that they deal with people and groups, period. They've got a lot of lawsuits they're dealing with. Not all of them are valid. Not all of them are fair. Some of them, there's nothing they could do. People are just going to file a lawsuit because, for whatever reason, they want to. I think the NASL stuff is frivolous. The NASL made decisions that killed their own business that had nothing to do with the Federation. there's nothing you can do about that. You could have avoided this. You could have avoided some other things that have come up. And the Federation has to do a better job of that. I really hope that the Federation does not take this as a win. They take this as an opportunity to sit down with at least a major part of this case ruled on. Not use that to your advantage, but just sit down and create a deal that everybody feels good about going forward, because the Federation needs the women on board to grow the game, which is part of their mission, to bring in more revenue, which is part of the business, because like it or not, every nonprofit is a business, and you have to think that way. If you don't, you're not going to be around very long. So they have to think about those things. They need everybody on board pushing in the same direction. Now is the time to get the men and the women in the room and say, this is what we want to do to work with both of you. We need both of you to grow this game. We need to have this now. We need to get on the same page going forward, especially in these times. And I hope that the Federation takes advantage of that and can do this and get it done correctly. And with new leadership, I have hope that they can, more than I've ever had hope that they can.
Tofka's come in this morning and says that the problem is that the women chose salary. They had to do so for a broad net of players who may or may not be playing frequently. That was needed because there isn't a strong league alternative for women's soccer that provides players with another source of income.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that they didn't take it for a broad number of players. It actually wasn't a very broad number of players. I want to see if I can find that really quick, how many it was. Because it wasn't that many. And that's part of the issue I've had with that structure, because it makes it hard for the coach to justify changing up the pool if you've got players on salary that you're not using. And I think those are, I don't know how long of a deal you sign. I don't know if it was 1 year, if it was renewed each year. You could change up the pool every year, if it was every 2 years, or what that structure was. But when you would look at the highest paid employees of the Federation, I mean, women's national team players were high on the list because of what they were getting. And that is part of the deal here, is that salary issue. It's a tricky one because, look, the club game doesn't pay the same like the men does. And the women were paid to make up for that. But if it had been structured maybe more of, and this would be hard to do because you do have players, especially now, who are going to be able to make more potentially in other countries and playing elsewhere. You wanted everybody to be in the NWSL because you wanted to grow that league. So there was a little bit of a push to play here. But if you had just paid that money to the NWSL as opposed to paying it directly to the women for their national team service, then the women would have had more of an argument. Because then it's the club and the national team stuff is separate. But by paying them a salary as part of their national team service to make up for the lack of money they were making at the club level, that's what made this a tough argument to make. And I think it was an impossible one, ultimately. I mean, the numbers back it up. You know, and I don't know if you could have said, if you did it 2011 through 2019, or if you'd picked some different way of bunching up the revenues or bunching up the amounts paid out. But when the argument is equal pay, and it's pretty equal, actually, the women are making a little bit more per game, it's a tough one to prove in a court of law. Now, the court of public opinion is a whole different conversation. But in the court of law, I don't really know what else could have been done here. I mean, it can be appealed, and again, that's not going to help anything. You know, it's not going to ultimately help any of this. And this is why the Federation, even though they won this part, They need to sit down and avoid an appeal and figure out what can be done to make this work going forward. But I do think the women have to be a little more consistent in message and figure out what's best for the game as a whole. And it's a different conversation than the men have because of the professional club structure. It is. And I hope that for the good of the game, they can figure that out, because right now, none of this is good for the game at all.
And Tafka follows it up by saying, what you just said is, he says, now that is probably the best summary of all of this. Quote, U.S. soccer needs to change how it deals with people. And then he says, between the xenophobia, gender equity, price gouging, worker discontent, and old boys system, there was practically nothing handled well.
Yeah, there's a lot of different elements that are a problem. It's not new. It's not like this is a sudden thing. The Federation, I mean, we talked about it with our national team stuff last week. You didn't have a full-time men's national team coach from 1985 to 1989. That's a long time ago, but it's not a long time ago. You've had a lot of issues with the Federation growing very quickly. I mean, when they won the bid for the World Cup in 94, that was 1988. They, I believe, in 87 or in 88, they were in pretty significant debt. Before they qualified for 1990, they'd already spent what they thought they would make for the team qualifying, because they did put the men on salaries, because the men didn't have a league to play in. They put a number of the men on salaries. Not big ones, but still on salary. They did the salary thing again between 90 and 94. They basically had a club team as a national team for a while because a lot of players didn't have a place to play. But not really until 94 did they really have significant money to work with. And that's ever. I mean, that's going back to, when the organization started in like 1913, I think. I mean, for most of that time, from 1913 to we'll say 90, you probably had an average of like one or two full-time people. And it's only really blown up here now. But you don't have, an organizational history. You have definitely an old boys network, and you've always had that. You have a lot of constituencies to deal with that have nothing to do with one another. The professional game has nothing to do with the youth game. It's even hard to say that the men's game and the women's game are on the same plane and conversation here. It's a tough job to run the U.S. Soccer Federation. It's tough. I'm not going to say it's easy and that everybody screwed it up because they were just bad. It's tough. It's very difficult to manage the politics of it. But that's not an excuse for some of the actions that have been made with the ticket pricing. It was just ridiculous. Insulting, especially after not qualifying for 2018. You do have to keep a difference in mind between CONCACAF pricing for a Gold Cup and U.S. soccer pricing for a friendly. There are different things. The Federation pricing for friendlies were awful. Just horrendous. More than anything, they have to change the culture. Because whether it's talk, rumor, innuendo, whatever, there's been enough said, where there's smoke, there's fire. You would probably think there's something to the toxic culture that has been talked about. And it's something that the Federation has to change. Because if you have a toxic culture, it's going to come out in how you deal with people. Again, this game is incredibly political in this country. And that's not all coming from the Federation. The Federation is part of that. I don't think they drive that. I think the politics of the Federation are a reflection of that. It's the sport in this country that is the weirdest in that regard, because you don't have a national federation for, American football that means anything. You have USA football, but they're not doing anything with the NFL. They're not doing anything with college football. They're not doing anything with really high school football. They don't really mean much. Same with basketball, same with baseball. The U.S. Soccer Federation affects everything related to it. But the issues from a political perspective and what you're wanting, the youth issues are very different than the pro issues. The men's issues are very different than the women's issues. It's kind of hard to manage all of that. And as we've seen in so many different aspects of soccer in this country, there has always been a protection of turf. There has always been a threat to litigate. And there has always been a very single-minded focus on what's best for me or my club as opposed to what's best for the game. And that's put the Federation in tough spots sometimes. Like I said, the NASL argument for me and that court case that people want to lump in with everything else, frivolous. The NASL made so many bad decisions, honestly, from the very beginning, that the Federation not granting them second division status after they had it and hadn't done anything with it and couldn't meet the standards that they requested. That one, people blame the Federation. I don't think the Federation was wrong in that. Again, could you have communicated standards? Could you have communicated better? There's probably plenty of reasons why you could. Were there reasons why maybe that communication wasn't great with a league that wasn't good at communication either, by the way? Yeah, there's probably something to that. The Federation has to create a better environment for this sport. They have to take the lead. And they need the national teams to do it. I mean, what is the most high-profile representation of U.S. soccer? The national teams. It's not MLS. MLS is there for MLS. USL is there for USL. The NWSL is there for the NWSL. Youth clubs are there for themselves. The national teams are the greatest representation of the organization that you have. And to have a bad relationship with one of your national teams, and hey, you don't have a CBA with the men either right now, and they're next in line to really start to have a lot to say. You need to get all that resolved now. And you need to get them pushing in the right direction to start to change this culture of toxicity in the game as a whole. Federation's part of it. But it's not necessarily a great environment for the game as a whole, because very few people in the game are thinking about the overall health of the game. It's a lot of single-mindedness. It's a lot of selfishness. And it's a lot of self-preservation. And I get that. The Federation has to be above that. They can't fall into those politics. And I think they have far too often. And this is an opportunity to move forward. This is an opportunity to fix things and to make things right and to build a better relationship. And I think Cindy Parlow-Cone wants to do that. I mean, why would she not want to support the team that she played for? You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of a no-brainer.
Yes.
It's different. You go back. Carlos Cordero didn't come up as a player through the national teams. Sunil Gulati, same. Sunil Gulati did everything in the Federation pretty much. I mean, I've been doing research on World Cup bids, and his name's coming up in the late 80s as somebody who scheduled the games for the national team. I mean, he's done it all, and most of it as a volunteer. Did he handle things well at the end of his run? No. Doesn't mean he didn't do good things for the game, but he did mess things up, absolutely. And he allowed a bit of this culture to fester, and it kept getting worse. But he didn't come from the playing side. He didn't come from, being in the locker room side of it, the team side of it. I don't remember the exact run before him, but you've had a lot of different people who have not come from that side of things, the playing on the national team side of it. We'll see if Cindy Parlow-Cone can bring some of these groups together, because she is coming from the outside. She didn't come up through the state associations. She didn't come up, as a volunteer in the federation. She came in from the outside, and she's brought a CEO in from the outside. Both know how things work, but they haven't been part of how they've worked before. I think that could ultimately be a good thing. But they've got to really understand why things are the way they are, why some of this, toxicity is there, and what they can do to change it. And this is the opportunity to change it. And they have to. They have to get back to a clean slate with this.
John Nason came in this morning. He says that people didn't pay attention to the details. And
it wasn't
then,
really reported much either.
Yeah.
And that, hey, I'm not going to lie. I mean, this hasn't been an easy thing to talk about because people have been very, visceral about it.
Yeah.
And we've mentioned the salary conversation a lot in this. But I'm sure that people have thought about how they have presented this and have not wanted to get the pushback and not wanted to seem insensitive. Look, equal pay is an issue. We all know that. It absolutely is an issue across industry. In this situation, the payouts were different and were handled differently, but the overall compensation, the numbers bear it out. Are there reasons for that? That's an argument that you could make, but it's a tough argument to make. Because one team's performance in terms of not qualifying for a World Cup, is that enough of a justification to say, well, that's why these numbers are the way they are? I don't know if they even tried that justification. I don't think they did. I think it was just over this period of time, the pay wasn't equal. And ultimately it wasn't, but the amount was actually slanted towards the women on a per game. Go ahead. I'm sorry, with John Nason's.
No, just he said that people didn't pay attention to the details, and then he references the Joe Biden tweet, not where Biden comes out and says, don't give up on this fight. He said on Twitter on Saturday, this is not over yet. To U.S. soccer, equal pay now, or else when I'm president, you can go elsewhere for World Cup funding, end quote.
Again, it's listening to the press statements and not getting into the details. And look, Joe Biden's running for president. And that's a statement that is going to play with a part of the voting base that he's trying to get. We know how this works.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, the equal pay now, well, numbers. It's there. And to bring up the World Cup funding part of it is not a well thought out statement, because what is the single thing that can result in more revenue coming into a federation than anything else in the world? Hosting a men's World Cup. If you have more revenue, you can pay more out to the men and the women. It's just an incredibly foolish thing. And again, I get it. It's a visceral reaction. But it's a bad look in general because it doesn't have any detail, any nuance. And now I hope, and these things usually don't go that way, but I really do have hope that people do pay attention to the details because they're important here. They're absolutely important here. Another element of this that was pointed out by Stephen Bank that I think is a very important part. Bonuses and compensation are different things. And it's a different argument. So my understanding of the deal, in a very broad sense, that the women struck in their CBA was, instead of higher amounts on making a roster, being called into a camp, being part of a tournament roster, et cetera, they took less there and got guaranteed money. I don't know if that argument then took the next step of you're going to make less in a bonus and you're going to make more in compensation. If it did, I think a lot of people are going to take that. I would. And maybe I'm not, Michael Jordan enough here to think that I'm going to win everything. But if the argument is you can make more money up front, but less in a bonus if you win a tournament, if you win X, or you can make more if you win it, but it's all tied to winning it. Well, the women wanted the salary structure, first off, and they needed it. It's a different conversation. But I would take the secure money. Some people would bet on themselves, and I get that. But in this case, because they wanted salary anyway, probably going to take less in the bonus as part of that trade-off. But as Stephen Bank points out, like bonus and compensation are really two different conversations. And if you sacrifice some of the bonus to get more up front, then it's almost impossible to argue about the bonuses.
Kurt McGirt this morning says, politics aside, the Fed's looking at American soccer is probably needed a bit. U.S. soccer have no natural predators, which lead to bad decisions. Someone looking or threatening to look might change how some decisions get made.
Well, I think a lot of the predators come from within, and that's the sad part about it. But again, this is not new, and some of it is because of the way the Federation has operated over the years. You've created mistrust. You've created some of the politics that are there. Other times you just played into it. They haven't always made the best decisions in long-term planning and growth because of, you come to an election, if you're the president or if you're on the board and you come up for election, you're not just dealing with the professional leagues as part of the vote or the players part of it, which was a big part of the last presidential vote. You have the youth, you have the state associations, you have all kinds of different constituencies that have nothing to do with one another. And a lot of times they operate against one another. We've talked about it at the professional level. I saw it firsthand with the Silverbacks. I saw it firsthand with people involved in the youth game that said that they would not support the Atlanta Silverbacks. And a lot of it stemmed to the Silverbacks being involved in a merger of two clubs in Cobb, and that didn't go well, and probably wouldn't have if the Silverbacks name hadn't been attached to it. They eventually got it right. It took time. But because of that, and whatever other reasons, you had people in this state, in the youth game, actively work against a professional team. Made no sense. Made absolutely no sense. Nothing good for the game out of that. You hear arguments now about, Atlanta United's academy is taking our players. Well, they're not your players. They're kids. And if you want the best for those kids, you should want them to be at the highest level. And playing for a professional academy is the highest level. It just is. It's not a knock against what you've been doing. Your club, or whatever club we're talking about, has done good work, has produced good players, and will get the rub from your player moving on to a professional academy. But you get these little whispers. Go look at a youth soccer message board sometime, and it'll blow your mind. Some of y'all I know have been part of these message boards, and have read them, have been part of the youth game, but I just get blown away sometimes by some of the vitriol towards other elements of the game in this country. Look, the game grows, and people have thought this and said it as far back as the late 60s. This game in this country grows when two things are healthy. Three, if you want to break them down by gender. When the professional leagues are strong and you have a presence in each community day in, day out of a professional team to rally around. When that's strong, the game is strong and the game grows. The other one is the national team. And the national team for a long time fueled the growth of soccer in this country because you didn't have much growth on the professional side. When those things are not strong, the game suffers. Simple as that. Soccer in the United States is not going to grow because of your neighborhood youth club. It's not. Doesn't mean your neighborhood youth club's not important. It is. It's very important. It fills a need that professional clubs and national teams can't. But what's going to drive it to your average person? The Landon Donovan goal. You know, your local team win an MLS Cup. Your local team winning the USL Championship. You know, like there's the NWSL. There's lots of this. Those are the things that are going to drive it. You know, you saw people coming together to watch the women win the World Cup. You've seen people come together to watch the men in a World Cup. It's been a minute, but it happened. Trust me. You see people come together to watch professional games. That's going to drive it. So this infighting between youth and pro, or the men and the women, or different elements of youth, because that's where it gets even worse, is where it's like one section of youth is fighting with another section of youth. U.S. soccer kicks itself in the face far too often. And that's not easy to do, but somehow they are flexible enough to do it. And I really hope that they can stop doing it. Because Kurt's right in the sense that, I mean, you don't have a natural competitor, like you don't have another soccer federation in this country. You're competing with other sports, you're competing for entertainment dollars, you're competing for attention. You know, there's things you're competing with, but you shouldn't have these things constantly kicking you in the face because it's coming from within. And it's got to stop. You know, does it happen in other sports? Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm sure it happens with, you know, Olympic sports. I'm sure it happens across the board, but U.S. soccer has seemed to be really bad about this for a long period of time. And I just hope that if this is the issue that can get at least some motion in the right direction of people pushing in the right direction and the Federation taking a leadership role and doing what's right for the game as a whole, maybe it can start to change the attitude. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know, but I'm hoping.
Yeah, you mentioned punching in the face by yourself. I was thinking Lucy in the football.
Soccer, you know.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking Lucy. Yeah, I was thinking Lucy in the football with Charlie Brown.
No, it's not even that, because that doesn't really do that much damage. Nobody's pulling the ball away. It's people saying, like, all right, I love soccer and I support soccer and I have a youth club and I have a, you know, kids play, et cetera, but I don't care about the program. The program's stupid. I don't care. It's a waste of time. They took our best player from our best team. I mean, it's like, really? Okay. The men and the women, like people who have, for whatever reason, jumped on this thing that like, oh, the women's team is blah, blah, blah. No. Right now, the women's team has been the best representation of U.S. soccer because the men have been garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's then the same the opposite way, because I've heard it the opposite way of just, oh, well, who cares if the men's team does anything? It's all about the women. It's like, no, that's not true either, because they all need one another. The number one thing in the sport for the United States to be part of, because they can't be part of the European Champions League, you know, you don't have American teams in the Premier League. The biggest thing that the United States can be part of in the sport is the Men's World Cup. It is. Like it or not, it is. It's never a good thing when the men don't qualify for the World Cup. It's a very bad thing for the game. Revenue goes down to the Federation. Money that goes out from the Federation to organizations that need it. It's not there anymore. It's a very bad thing. Next is the women. The Women's World Cup is going to continue to grow. It is going to become more equal with the Men's World Cup every time around. Because finally, people are realizing that the women's World Cup and the women's game in general, when you stop looking at it as a charity and you look at it as a business and you realize people want to buy tickets, people want to watch, which means people want to advertise, which means people want to sponsor. There is a business there. That's how it will grow. And it will grow. But right now, the Men's World Cup is what drives the game. It is the biggest thing that American soccer can be part of, followed by the Women's World Cup. Then you have MLS. Those things are true. If you like your local team, if you like your local youth club, if that's what you support, if that's where your energy is, that is great. That is wonderful. But when people in those situations actively work against other things in the game, it's bad. I mean, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible in terms of good and bad, but it's bad. Because you are hurting yourself in the long run. It's not good if the big high-profile elements of American soccer fail. It is a very bad thing because it does trickle down.
Also in this morning, yeah, no doubt. Bartimus Prime stopped in Louisville on Saturday, walked around the new soccer stadium there, and he says, "I don't think I've ever been more encouraged about the future of the game in this country, and I can only see positives coming for that club and soccer in Kentucky." Hashtag Monday whatever.
And Louisville has created a great stadium. They have a great USL championship team. They will have an NWSL team. They are launching academies. All those things are very good. And it's not a knock on anything that was in Louisville before Louisville City existed, but, man, it's elevated it. You weren't going to build a stadium for anything that was going on in Louisville before that. The ownership is building that stadium because, again, it's a business. And that's okay. But that's going to help everything else grow. We've seen it here in Atlanta. Numbers are up. More kids are playing soccer in this area because of the success of Atlanta United. I would assume it's a smaller scale, but I would assume that that's the case in Louisville. In some parts, things are down because the local team is not connecting, not getting that interest, not working to grow the game. You have to grow the game. That is something that is unique to soccer that, the NFL teams, they do it. A lot of times they do it from a community relations standpoint, but up until probably now, and if they don't start doing it, they're going to have some problems in the long run. You haven't had to try to grow the game. The NFL hasn't been worried about growing football. There's nothing to grow. It's fine. Soccer's had to do that. You've always had to have that thought. It's a very important element of it. And building a stadium, hey, if you were in the media and you were questioning it, or if you were in the community and you were like, soccer, I don't get soccer, I don't really care. You build a stadium like that, you have to at least respect it. You have to at least change your tone from I don't care to, well, I'm not emotionally invested, but I respect it, and that's a pretty big undertaking, so I'm assuming there's some money involved in all of this, and that's probably meaning that it's doing okay. And then attitudes start to change. But yeah, like the stadium in Louisville, those types of venues are very important. And I know we zero in a lot on MLS, obviously, and there's a lot of talk about the big stadiums that are being built around the country, but Louisville, Statesboro, others of that ilk are Colorado Springs. They're very, very important. And that's taking it to a step that I didn't know if we'd get to anytime soon. I expected MLS to grow. I expected MLS to be a bigger deal than it was 5 years ago. I thought Atlanta United could get to this kind of level. I thought it'd take more time, but I didn't know if the lower divisions would respond in kind and would grow in the same way. And, man, the growth and the infrastructure and the investment going on in the lower divisions is really, really powerful and important, and I hope it can continue.
I mean, if you just look at the USL, New Mexico, Phoenix, Sacramento, as the Republic before they got into.
But it's not just having a successful team; it's building stadiums, because that's
Right.
that's a different level.
Right.
You can have there's been successful teams. Rochester Rhinos were a very successful team. Ultimately, couldn't last, and they halfway they built a stadium, but they didn't have complete control over it, and then it all fell apart. Like New Mexico, the next step is building a venue or controlling a venue.
Yeah.
That's the next step for them, because it's fleeting while you're renting. USL attendance-wise it's better than it's ever been. It's obviously bigger than it's ever been too, but it's the stadiums, it's the infrastructure, it's the academies, it's the investment. That's the next level. And that's what should make you feel good about the game. We've seen second division teams come up with big attendances over the years. It's investment for the long haul, because that's roots. It's not going anywhere if you have a bad year when you start to have that level of investment.
Right. Would you like to hear about our friends at Appolinsky & Associates?
Yes, I would.
All right. AA-legal.com, proud supporters of anything and everything SDH and SDH Network. Stephen Appolinsky & Associates. 30 years of experience on the plus side of that. More than $40 million in judgments in their favor in Georgia and Alabama. You can go to their online chat. It's up and running right this very second. You can start a chat with a representative, and that's available 24/7, 365. Or you can reach out to Steve at 404-377-9191. You can request a free consultation. You can also reach out to Steve at Steve, S-T-E-V-E, at aa-legal.com if you believe in the emails. Knowledgeable, compassionate, successful trial lawyers for wrongful death and personal injury trials. Recognized as legal elite by Georgia Trend magazine for being one of the most effective lawyers in Georgia. Stephen Appolinsky, the firm's founder, has been recognized as one of the top 100 trial attorneys in Georgia. Live chat, aa-legal.com. Fire off an email to Steve himself at steve at aa-legal.com, or give him a buzz at 404-377-9191 to get your free consultation. Appolinsky & Associates, LLC, trial lawyers, proud supporters of everything soccer down here in SDH Networks.
Absolutely.
Stizzle A is in this morning as we are in hour number 2. And Stizzle says that the game is growing all over the U.S. In my region, there isn't an MLS franchise within 3 hours of home, yet have hundreds of youth teams. Up north, we need better organization and leadership on the hashtag Monday whatever.
Yep. And, you're at a point where you have had years of growth. The game is very different now than it was. But if you look at governing bodies, if you look at state associations, if you look at leadership in clubs, it's a lot of the same people that were there before, and a lot of them do great work. But are there some who are maybe not thinking about the future, maybe not thinking big picture? Yeah, because it happens in any organization that's membership-driven. I mean, you got to remember, for the most part, and the U.S. Soccer Federation is a little different because it's bigger, but even them, they have a lot of volunteers that are involved in this. State associations, tons of volunteers make everything happen. And they're volunteers, they have regular roles in the soccer industry for the most part, whether it's running a club or being a coach or et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to see, I think, some new blood. I think some new ideas. I think some new approaches in the game as a whole to grow. Because you're going to get, if you are trying to think of a random area, if you are in Fayetteville, Arkansas, you're going to get a bump if the men do well in a World Cup. You're going to get a bump if the women do well in the World Cup. MLS isn't going to affect you because it's not near you. So you're going to get those bumps when World Cup stuff goes well. On the women's side, you'll get a bump during the Olympics. That's going to give you a bump outside of your control. But the day-to-day, there's a lot of stuff on the ground in a community like that has to be done. You have to, if you're the state association, you need to be in those areas. You need to be working to improve coaching education in those areas so players get better and better every generation because they're getting better coaching. They're getting modern coaching. They're getting the new styles of coaching where the game is today. Alongside of that, referee development, because you can have great players, you can have great coaches, but if referees can't control games because they're not getting the proper training, then the games suffer, and then the game as a whole suffers. You need director of coaches training. Like, that's where these federations and state associations need to be focused, is development, training, education. Grow those areas. And then you will get people on the ground in these different parts of either your area in a state or in the country that can grow the game on your behalf, but with the proper training. Those things are vital. And I hope that, we talked about it with the Development Academy. I hope that U.S. Soccer puts resources towards coaching development across all clubs. And maybe now this kind of takes playing favorites out of it to a degree and just focuses on growing the game at all club levels. They need to, because that's their job. And referees have to go alongside of it and everything else. But this is the hope, because not every part of the country is going to have that extra effect of a local pro team, whether it's MLS or NWSL or USL Championship or so on down. Not everybody's going to have that. That's where a state association, that's where local people on the ground running clubs have to take on a little more responsibility in what they do. Could be a local college program that really gets out in the community and provides coaching education where they can. It's, if you're in the game, in my opinion, there is a responsibility to grow it and make it better for the next generation. I think there is. Maybe it's a bigger responsibility than it is in other sports. Maybe it's unfair. I don't know. That's not to say that you're not looking out for yourself and you're not looking out for your job and your section of the industry and job security and all that. That's not to say that you don't worry about those things. But I think you have to try to leave the game in a better place than when you found it. That has to be part of your thinking. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy for having that mindset, but I think it's a massively important part of this, and this game specifically, because there's still a lot of room to grow.
And when there's a lot of room to grow, I would think that being a good steward is a part of the deal, that you would want to leave it in a better place than when you came into it.
That's how I think. I mean, I don't know if that's strange or not, but I think that's
I don't think it's strange.
I mean, for me, the game has given me everything. I mean, I found it when I was 9. I played other sports. Loved soccer from the day I found it, and then when I saw a World Cup for the first time, it went to a whole nother level. And it's not to say that I'm not the kind of soccer fan who dismisses other sports, and I think that's something that has hurt our game for a long period of time. I don't think that helps. That attitude is something that people have picked up on. I mean, I've heard it from people in the sports field my whole life. Is soccer snobs, attitude, whatever about it. Love basketball. I've loved watching The Last Dance. It's been the highlight of every Sunday night. I loved watching the NBA at that time. I still love watching the NBA. I don't have the same love for the college game like I used to, but that's a little bit more about the one and dones and structure and all that. I love basketball. I watch football. I don't really watch baseball like I used to, but I pay attention and try to keep up with what's going on in the Braves world. But soccer's given me everything that those sports wouldn't have given me. You know, like I have a job in it. I have friends because of it. You know, I've had a lot of, just rewarding experiences because of it. So I feel like I have to give back to the next generation to have those opportunities and better ones. So I hope that a lot of people in the game have that mentality, because that's how it's going to grow. Because there is still an opportunity for growth, especially leading up to 26 with a World Cup coming here. Because what it did in 94 for this game, if the U.S. hadn't gotten 94, you wouldn't have MLS. You would not have the U.S. Soccer Foundation that's done amazing work for a long time in growing the game in underserved communities. You would have had a strong women's national team. You had obviously won a World Cup in 91. In 88, when the Federation was awarded the World Cup, the women's program was very small. It would have grown on its own. Would you have had the same level of resources to put to it after 94? No, you wouldn't have, because you wouldn't have had a professional league either on the men's side. I don't know if the growth would have been what it was. Just the attention. I mean, how many sports writers, editors, etc., in 94, would write something like, well, I never really got into soccer, or you can't consider me a soccer fan, but man, I really loved this. This was really fun. You got some of that, and that's the first step to changing it. We've seen it here in Atlanta. I mean, you see it almost every day. Well, I can't really say I'm a soccer fan per se, but there's always that but, because I guess maybe you feel like you have to justify it to the people who are still anti-soccer from the 1984 old columns that they wrote.
The other sports that the other fans of the other sports that you've written about.
But this is the thing. I've noticed this for 10 years, and I think it's only going to continue to grow. That attitude is really going away among young people because they've grown up with soccer. It's not what it was when I was a kid. When I was a kid in the 80s, I was the weird kid for not just playing soccer, but being passionate about it. Because people played. But I was watching, Italian games whenever I would find out that they were going to be on FNN Score. Or I was watching the national team games that ESPN would pick up occasionally. And I was reading, Soccer America, and if we could find World Soccer, because that was in the bookstore occasionally, we'd do it. Like I was to that level. So I was the weird kid. Now, if you grow up knowing about Barcelona and Lionel Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo or a World Cup game or whatever, it's not weird. It's just not strange. So this whole idea that people even need to be I'm not really a soccer fan.
The justifications that you say.
There's no need for that. Like now it's just part of the conversation. It just is. So stop doing that, people. Stop being that guy. It's dumb. Just talk about it like it's a sport that you talk about. And if you don't know that much about it, that's okay too. And like I've said many times, on the soccer side, don't be judgmental either. If people are coming to the party, invite them in, hand them a beer. Like it's the turf war stuff has always been part of the soccer world, and in this case, it's been something that doesn't help. If people want to learn more and want to talk about it, good. Come on in, and let's talk.
I was Soccer Made in Germany guy, but at the same time, I watched baseball growing up. I was a baseball guy. I was college football guy. I was, playing those sports in my backyard, but I was also Soccer Made in Germany guy on PBS. That's the way it was for me when I started out.
But no, I mean, you've said this to me before. Like, yes, you watched Soccer Made in Germany and you went to soccer camps, but you weren't soccer first.
No, I was not.
That's what I'm saying. Is I was. Like, there were very few kids like you who I think were more like, well, yeah, they paid attention to soccer like they paid attention to others, but you couldn't. Like, let's be real. Like, as hard as I worked to pay attention to it, you couldn't pay attention to soccer in the same way.
Mm-mm.
Because it just wasn't there. It wasn't accessible.
Right.
I mean, I'd go to bookstores, and if 442 or World Soccer popped up on the shelf, I would buy it. I read every book in the library that they had to check out on soccer. If ever it was on TV and I knew about it, I watched it. I mean, I was a fan of other sports, as I still am, but I worked hard to find any soccer that there was because that was my passion. Now it's a lot easier. Now it's not weird if you are talking to a teenager, let's say a high school student. If you're talking to a high school student and you have a conversation about the Braves, the Hawks, and Barcelona, like, it's not that weird.
Nope.
It's just not. Whether they're watching Barcelona on a regular basis or they're playing FIFA or whatever. Like, it's just not that strange. So the whole justification about, like, well, but on soccer, it's like, no, stop. It's just part of the conversation now.
Mm-hmm.
The numbers bear it out. Is it the biggest? No. Is there still room to grow? Yeah. But you have to keep growing it. And in this country, there's still a lot of room to grow. And the federation, the state associations, the people that are in those roles have to take that on as part of the deal. Is you have to grow it.
What else is on your mind domestically this morning?
Tafka asked a question before about if U.S. Soccer goes that route, X dollars to both teams, and only changing the mechanism of distribution, we'll run into a problem when the number of call-ups is different between the two. When I say X number of dollars, I think you're probably going to have to get even more granular in terms of the amount of games or X per game, because you're going to play a different number of games. The women play more friendlies than the men because you don't have the club side as strong, and the women have played more friendlies historically. It's just, I don't think that's necessarily going to change anytime soon. So it's a little hard, and this would probably be something that the legal situation might help. But if you're going to negotiate it, you're going to come to a conclusion. Is it just that for every 4 years you're going to pay both the same chunk of money and then they divide it up however they want, or is it going to be you're going to pay them the same rate per game, and then that's going to affect salary? If the women want salary, that's going to affect everything else. Whatever the X is to make it equal, that's what I'd like to see. And the basic stuff, and I've said this from day one on all this, like the basic stuff of per diem and travel accommodations and that kind of stuff, that has to be equal. It should have been equal to begin with, even with the salary component of it. There was no reason for per diems to be different. That's just an awful look, and it creates some of this friction. Like, that's just horrible. So make all the basic stuff equal, make everything equal, and you're going to have to account for a different number of games and different kinds of competitions year to year because it's going to be different. Even 4 year to 4 year, it's going to be different. But you have to figure out what X is to make equal. If it's the amount per game played, or if it's the amount per year, or the amount per cycle. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what people would rather take, but whatever that is, whichever way you want to divide it up, that has to be equal. That's the way I would do it.
Soccer for Good OG, Jill Robbins is in this morning, and she had a quick conversation with a soccer industry vet, and we agreed that the drastically different landscape in organized soccer opens opportunities for promoting free play/street soccer. She wanted to know your thoughts and how to go about doing this and the likelihood that this will happen anyway.
The likelihood that street soccer will happen anyway, I think, is very low. Because I think where just activity is going, and it's been going this way for a while, I don't think kids are going out into the neighborhood and just playing any sport on their own like they used to. Like I did, like you did, like, kids 10 years younger than me did, I think it's not as common, and I don't think that's going to change. Just lives are more structured now. You're signing up for activities as opposed to creating your own. I don't see that changing. But what I do think is very important, and if you've studied the way players have developed and big parts of how they develop in the right ways, free play is a very important element. And it's something that structured clubs need to think about, how to foster free play in their environments. And I think some do. I mean, I've had this conversation with Tony Annan, and he's worked even at a professional academy side to have a free play element to give ownership of the game to the kids involved. If it's 1 day a week, coaches drop a bag of balls and drop cones and drop pennies on the field and then go off to the side and say, y'all figure it out. Play a game. Do what you want. And you let them do it, and if you have to, step in and kind of push them, nudge them in the right direction, maybe you do it at the beginning, and then they get used to it. I just don't think kids have that same idea that we did. I mean, we would, if we had 5 kids, we'd figure out how to play 2-on-3. If, we had an odd number of kids playing football in the neighborhood, somebody was an all-time quarterback. Play basketball and play 2-on-2 or 3-on-3 or whatever, and made up our own baseball games. We never had 18 people to play 9-on-9 in baseball, so we'd make up a home run derby game. Like, I don't know, just because it's not as common, if you might not have to help nudge in the right direction. But from a soccer perspective, free play is critical. Because what does it develop more than anything? Decision-making. And that's the number one element for a young player. The speed of decision-making. You get players who are faster than others. You get players who are more technical than others. But if you are able to make decisions quicker, you can bridge some of those gaps. And when you have an elite player who can make decisions quickly, then you get a Lionel Messi. You get a player like that. So I really wonder if free play in general, outside of any kind of structure, is going to grow. I don't think it is, and I do wonder what the effects of coronavirus is going to have on that potentially. I wonder if parents might keep their kids even more structured because of that. That we'll have to wait and see. But in general, I don't think kids are making their own games in the neighborhood or in the park like they used to, and I don't think that's necessarily going to come back. But I do think it's an important element for soccer organizations to foster because, from a soccer player perspective, they build the decision-making. But just from a kid perspective, personalities emerge, leaders emerge. You figure out how to talk to people. I mean, there's so many different things that go into it that I didn't think about when I was a kid, and round up kids in the neighborhood and say, hey, we're going to play soccer today. And this is how we divide it up. And you be over here on this team. And okay, well, now it's really out of balance, and let's switch. You guys trade teams, whatever. And you'd make it up, and people would take on leadership roles and learn how to deal with one another. Wherever organizations can foster that, even if it's not like it used to be, I think it's still valuable. So I hope that free play and street soccer and all those elements are a part of the game going forward, but I think they're going to look different.
All right, you ready to see what's going on overseas?
Sure.
All right, well, as of about an hour ago, reports from both the Daily Telegraph and local outlets say the Premier League side Wolves have asked their players and management to return to their training ground to start training. Okay. Wolves plan to return to action next Monday as all players will be tested for coronavirus and step up their training sessions, which will become more intensive. This is from Joe Prince Wright and our friends at Pro Soccer Talk. The plan is then for them to train individually at first, then train in small groups as they await further details surrounding Project Restart.
Well, there's a lot of stuff on Project Restart and the Premier League as a whole and where this can go. If Wolves are trying to get everybody together, that's fine. The Daily Mail has an article from Matt Hughes that the league is pleading for unity because there are claims that the bottom six are trying to block Project Restart because they want to avoid relegation, and the top clubs want guarantees that 3 teams will go down. All for one, one for all, right? Yeah. This was after Friday's shareholders meeting, so the biggest clubs are trying to persuade the bottom 3 to play on because the bottom clubs don't want to play because they think if they don't finish the season, they won't have relegation. Well, the Dutch, again, are having relegation. Or no, wait a minute. No, the Dutch are not. Sorry. France is. Mixing up my countries that have already decided to stop. France is having promotion relegation, although it's probably going to come to a judge first. The Dutch stopped the season and didn't have promotion relegation. So now this conversation's coming up in the Premier League. The bottom 3 clubs don't want to play out the season because they don't want to get relegated. They might get relegated anyway, or at least have to then take it to the courts. But they're trying not to play. This is only going to get dumber. I mean, let's be real. This is only going to get dumber. Because now we're at the point where you've got different groups arguing about wanting to play and not play because of what they think it's going to do to them. I'm going to guess that the league needs to go ahead and come out and say what they're going to do in terms of promotion relegation. I think they're going to have to make that decision first.
Yeah.
If they're going to say that, look, whether we finish the season or not, it obviously is not going to be a normal season. So in light of that, we're not going to have relegation. And we're going to have promotion, and we're going to work backwards from there, and we'll do that next year, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, then you eliminate that issue with teams not wanting to finish the season because they don't want to get relegated. Then they want to finish the season. The argument for teams to finish the season, I don't know why the top clubs are arguing for the relegation unless they just don't want a larger Premier League next year. They don't want more games.
Then I imagine that the TV revenue then would be divided that much more if you're adding three more clubs, and there wouldn't be as much money handed out by positions that you finish in the table too.
But you'd have more games, so you'd have more revenue from games, and you would be providing more games to your TV partner, so you would probably go and have a conversation and say, well, you were paying X amount for X number of games. Well, now we have Y number of games, and why don't we figure out what that Y number you're going to pay us is? I would assume that would be a realistic conversation to have, and that's probably one that should be had right now because that's going to drive part of this. But more importantly, as we've said from day one with this, everybody's going to take a hit. Whether you're Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, Tottenham, Norwich, Brighton, Villa, teams in the championship, and so on. You are going to take a hit from this no matter who you are. Period. The leagues that figure out how to work together to avoid the widest hit are going to be the leagues that come out of this the best. MLS, because of its structure, that's how it's structured. So it will not have as big of a hit to teams that would have had a bigger hit without that structure. Germany has created a solidarity fund, and they have talked about working together pretty consistently through all of this. They seem to be on the same page with everything. That's very important. When you have this kind of infighting, It's only going to slow the process down, and it's only going to cause more damage. And somebody's got to take the leadership role, whether it's the Premier League, whether it's the FA, whether it's the Football League, whether it's the FA getting all of them into a room to figure this out, whether it's the government getting into the room to figure this out. If it stays like this is going to do damage to the sport. Period.
Brighton chief exec Paul Barber opposed the Premier League's plan to complete the campaign using 10 neutral venues, saying that such a move would damage the integrity of the competition. Crystal Palace chair Steve Parish responded in the Sunday Times with a strong expression of and this is from the Daily Mail article, the social and economic case for football's return.
Yep. There is. And that's everywhere. Sport's a powerful thing. It is. It's not your everyday business or thing. It just isn't. I mean, if you've followed the documentary about a team that is 22 years old now in The Last Dance, and how many people have been enthralled, excited, talking about it. I mean, it's been wild. And I think it shows part of the power of sport. Having sport back would be a good thing. Because, look, this virus isn't going to go away overnight, no matter what anybody says. It's not happening. It's going to be around, and could it come back? Could it come back in a second wave? All that stuff is on the table. Nobody knows. We've never seen anything like this one. We haven't. I mean, yes, there was a Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919. I didn't live through that. This is different than that, too. So, it's not going to go away overnight. People need positive things to rally around and motivate them and give some hope. Sport's one of those things that does that. Before this, it was one of those things that does that. After this, it's going to be one of those things that does that. It will be a big deal when you have sports to talk about and rally around, and it's big. So there is a greater role for teams to play, and I think it is incredibly selfish and short-sighted for Brighton to think that way, because they do serve a greater purpose. Is it? I mean, are you talking about competitive integrity really, really here? If you want to say that, then look, you could say that because you had the stoppage, whatever team was on a roll before this, well, man, the competitive integrity of their season has been ruined because they had to sit for months. Well, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do. You're not going to be able to play in front of fans, so you're not going to have home field advantage. So does it matter if it's being played in a neutral site? If you want to wait until you can play in front of fans, you might not finish this season until mid-21. Or who knows, later. We don't know. I think there is a greater purpose here to get back on the field from not even an economic standpoint, although that's part of it, just for the people. To get back on the field and give them something. You do have that kind of role if you're in the game, if you're in a club like Brighton. It is a very important part of it. And there is a financial component, too. I mean, yeah. Is it the same you're going to make if you had fans in the stands? No. But is it better than not playing games for another year? Yeah, I think it is.
You mentioned the FA, also from Catherine Bate at the Daily Mail. FA Chairman Greg Clark has admitted it's hard to see fans returning to football anytime soon. He says that supporters are the lifeblood of the game, but admitted the game faces substantial changes. And among those changes, Clark says that the board has agreed to a sensible, and that's a word in quotes, £75 million budget cut. Clark has said in a worst-case scenario, this would be necessary for the next 4 years to offset a £300 million deficit. So
that's at the FA. So
yes.
Understand what we're talking about. That's not the Premier League. That's not the Football League. That's not clubs. That's at the FA. U.S. Soccer is going to face that kind of issue. One thing that the FA has said is that women's football and the grassroots game will remain two central planks of that strategic planning. They are not trying to cut in those areas. They're trying to essentially build a fence around it and protect those areas. That's good. It's needed because, those are areas that need investment. And there's not an immediate return in terms of revenue resulting from that investment. It's a long-term investment. And those are things that you can't sacrifice in a time like this. Some will, and they'll miss out in the long run on it. And it's good to hear the FA protecting those areas. But, yeah, revenues are going to be down, flat out. I am getting to the point that I want people to be very careful about language they use. What was the quote? Like, anytime soon, we won't see fans in the stands anytime soon.
Yes.
Is that the quote, or is that a rough approximation of it?
Game faces substantial changes. Recapping it real quick, scrolling down. So, spot me a sec. And so, of course, the computer locks up.
Yeah. Anyway, that's close enough.
Yeah, it's close enough.
What does that mean? Anytime soon, it's like. That sounds very bad. And look, we might not see people in stands for a year. We might not see people in stands for 6 months. We might not see people in the stands for 3 months. We don't know. But I think being very careful about the words we use and not to push emotions to certain places is something I think we all have to be careful about. Anybody with a voice in this right now, we don't know when we're going to see spectators in the stands. Nobody does. Scientists don't. Doctors don't. CEOs don't. Nobody does. So it's fair to say we don't know when that'll be. But I think it's different saying it's not going to happen anytime soon. Again, it's all about what message you are sending to people, and it's not to lie. It's not to say, oh, they'll be back tomorrow. Yeah, don't worry, we'll have fans in the stands next week. It's all good. No, it's not to say that.
Lifeblood of the game returning to match.
John turned into a robot for a second. I think.
For a second. Yeah, he is. Here's the quote. For example, it's hard to foresee crowds of fans who are the lifeblood of the game returning to matches anytime soon.
Yeah, and that's the whole quote's not quite as loaded, but you see lots of loaded comments and using words that have loaded connotations. We just don't know when they're going to be back. We don't. And that means you can't plan on that revenue anytime soon because we don't know when that's going to happen. But I think there is an important element to keeping, as much as you can through all this, a positive outlook on when that might be, when that could happen, and what we can do in the meantime. Because there are things that the sport can provide to the general population in the meantime. And hopefully it will be games behind closed doors, in a neutral site or not, but behind closed doors, in a safe way, soon. Don't know when, but soon. Germany wants to get back soon. It's not going to happen this weekend, but they're probably on track to be the first. MLS has created their first step in terms of individual training and doing it outdoors and all the different precautions to do it. It is a step in that direction. Leagues are figuring it out. You had some positive tests in Germany. And I think the good sign of progress was not the immediate push, although I'm not going to lie, I did see it from some people that I'm just surprised would have the attitude. There was not this immediate outcry of, oh, shut everything down. Never going to happen again. Never going to play anymore. You did have some positive tests, and there was not a need. I think they've done a second level of tests on everybody in the group, and nobody else tested positive, which is a good thing. And you're going to figure out how to deal with it. That's why this process of ramping up is very important, because you're going to learn from it, and you're going to be able to take that forward to the next steps. But it's critical to make progress right now in all of this, even if it's very, very slow, like the MLS one. It's a very, very slow step, but it is a step, and it's an important one. And all those little steps will add up to playing games. Playing games will have a powerful effect on the population, but they will also have an effect on dollars and cents. Leagues do need those games to get played. Leagues that are waiting on TV money or hoping for more TV money need those games more than others. But you do need those games to be played. And that's going to drive some of this. But there is a greater reason for these games as well. It will be good for the population. There's no question about that.
Reuters this morning. Sassuolo in Serie A became the first Italian top-flight club to resume training following coronavirus stoppage. And Serie A club posted a video on Twitter showing players exercising individually, with each having half a pitch to himself. The club has limited the number of players who can train to 6 at a time, divided into 3 pitches, and says training is optional. The government yesterday gave players permission to start training individually on club premises, but no team exercises will be allowed until May 18th. And Reuters says it is still far from certain that Serie A will be allowed to resume this season.
Again, what does that mean, this season?
Yeah.
What that has no meaning anymore. Stop. Yes, nobody knows when they'll be able to resume, but they're going to resume something at some point. Whether it is the next season or whether it is finishing this season, I'm really getting to the point that, and maybe it's because quarantine paranoia or quarantine going crazy is part of it for me, but you've got to be very detailed in how these things are reported. You've got to be very careful about language and what you say. More than ever, it's not time to just be reckless and toss things off. And maybe it's just getting sloppier right now because everybody's kind of getting crazy at the moment. And I get it, but it's not good. Because that last line, it's unclear if the season will ever be, or when the season will return, or if the season will return, or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if it's the current season, if it's the next season, whatever. Like, they're going to play again at some point. We don't know what the timeline is. Nobody does. But this idea that, don't write it that way. I don't think that does anything. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't give any more info. It's loaded terminology. It doesn't help. I see an article in the Daily Mail. Let's pull this up real quick. La Liga's planned return could be in disarray with entire squads facing quarantine if a player has COVID-19. We literally saw this play out in Germany Friday. They didn't go into quarantine. They don't necessarily need to, especially if they are following all the protocols that are allowed right now. One of the reasons is to avoid that. And as we've talked about with the Utah Jazz and Rudy Gobert, because that started all of this, how many players with the Jazz tested positive? 2.
Donovan Mitchell was the other.
Yeah, that's it. Nobody else tested positive. Nobody else with the group tested positive. They were tested that night. They had their results. Like the bigger question, and I don't know the testing situation in Spain, but the bigger part of the Daily Mail's headline, and again, this is where you got to be careful because the first start could be in disarray with entire squads facing quarantine if a player has COVID-19, ... And league faces outrage over perfectly healthy stars getting checked before ordinary people. None of this happens without the proper testing. You can't just go back blindly and make the step to go from individual training to group training or from group training to full training without testing. And if you don't have enough tests for the general population, you can't justify the tests going to players. But what has concerned me that I've seen a few different groups say, because testing appears to be an issue worldwide, is that, well, we'll forego testing because there's not enough for the general population and we don't want to take them. Well, then you can't really progress in your steps to getting back to normal because you're not doing the testing. Then you're just taking guesses. And that's not a good situation to be in. That's where you have to be really careful. And that's going to be one of the major talking points about this, whether we're talking sport or not, is the testing element of it. And you've got to have the right level of testing, and it's got to be consistent. I mean, let's just try to play this out logistically, and please, if I am incorrect, if I'm wrong, please tell me. But you have Sassuolo, and they're going to play Brescia. And Sassuolo starts training. Everybody's clear. Everybody's good. They continue training. Everybody's good. They move to full training. Everybody's good. No positive tests. All is well. Same for Brescia. You play the game. Okay, the next day, you have somebody test positive. All right. Then you got to work backwards and figure it all out. Then you got to test everybody. This idea that everybody goes into quarantine, that's if you're not doing testing, right?
Yeah.
What was at the beginning of all this? And this is where you have to progress with the times. What was everybody told? You think you might have it? Self-quarantine yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't go anywhere to go try to find a test, because you didn't have tests at that point, really. Self-quarantine, period.
Mm-hmm.
We should have progressed past that to where if you play a match, somebody tests positive, you then test everybody. And you test them again that week. And you probably test them again before the next match. And if everybody's clear, everybody's clear. Because Gwen agrees. Because there's, I think, a fear, and I understand it, but it's not accurate, that if one player on a field tests positive, that every player is positive. And that just hasn't borne out. But you need to know, so you do the testing. If you can't do the testing, you can't make progress in coming back. I think it's that simple.
For me, it has always come down to testing, period. Because if you can't test, how do you know? And if someone has tested positive, say, then you have to work backward to try to figure out origins and figure out how to isolate causes and make sure that it can be properly treated. So for me, it has always come down to the testing element of this, whether you're trying to keep folks from getting, well, let me rephrase this. It comes down to the testing element as a matter of prevention and as a matter of treatment, is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, it's a matter of future prevention.
I
think that's an important part to specify, because some of the reporting has been just testing solves everything. And no, it doesn't. Like, it gives you more information. And you need information to deal with this. And right now we don't have enough. Because right now it's still people saying that, well, if one person tests positive, then you have to shut everything down. And that's just not true. The Utah Jazz are an example. Köln in Germany is an example. They had 2 players and 1 staff member, I believe. Like, names haven't been officially reported. That's what most people are going with. Test positive, and they've done another round of testing since, and nobody else tested positive. It's not an all or nothing thing. It hasn't shown that. Is it highly contagious? Yes. Does it spread in a large group? Yes. But even the game that a lot of people have pointed at in terms of Italy and Spain was Atalanta and Valencia, right?
Yes.
A lot of people have said that was the bomb for this in Europe and in those 2 countries specifically. You had 40,000 people in the stadium, and not all of them got sick. A far larger number would have got sick because they were there, because they were exposed to it, but not everybody did. And not everybody who got it got sick, really sick. Probably a lot of people got it and didn't know. The fact is that they can spread it is not a good thing, and that's why you're trying to be extremely careful with all this. But even that wasn't every single person in the venue got sick. You know what I mean? Like, that's the fear that I think is still coming up, that is just, it's not accurate. You have to be careful because we don't know enough. We're not doing enough testing. There's not enough testing worldwide. It's not even just a U.S. problem. Smaller countries that have done enough testing of their whole population have handled this better because they have a more complete picture. If we're going to have more interaction, and playing games and interacting on a soccer field is definitely a step to more of that, you've got to have the testing to back that up and continue to support it. If you don't have that, you're playing a guessing game. It might work out. It might not. There's no way to know without the testing. So I just keep coming back to testing to make that next step, because I don't think you really reasonably can without it.
Yep.
And we'll see. But that also has to go along with this idea that if one person in a group that is training tests positive, it doesn't mean that everybody is sick. And it doesn't mean you have to quarantine everybody. If you have the testing, then no, you don't. Because you'll be able to check. You know, like you're not then self-quarantining because you don't know. You're testing and nobody else is sick, or one more person's sick, or 5 more people are sick. And then you deal with it because you have the information. That's the issue that the game is going to face. And until you have that level of testing, and it is a very valid conversation, it's a bad look and it's a PR hit if the teams and players are getting a level of testing that the population is not. That's not good.
No.
And leagues and teams, they're able to afford it. So they're able to go out and pay for it. They're not getting it given to them by the government. That's an element that I think at times has been lost in this. They can go out and buy it. And if they choose to go out and buy it, they choose to go out and buy it. But from a public perception, from a PR hit, they're going to take one if they do that and get back on the field when others who want a test can't get it. That will happen. Is it worth the trade-off? That's what they're going to have to measure that.
Couple of other, before we go to Twitter to wrap up, just real quick. From the Reuters article, Bologna and Atalanta have already confirmed in Serie A they'll start training on Tuesday. Inter Milan said they would open their training center from this week with further details to be confirmed, and this is directly from the article. The Italian government will have the final say over whether the Serie A season can resume. The main sticking point appears to be the medical protocol drawn up by the Italian Football Federation, which Sports Minister Vincenzo Spadafora described last week as insufficient.
Yeah, that's got to support all this, because if you don't have the proper protocols, you're potentially going to create a problem, and if a problem arises, you're not going to have the protocols in place to deal with it, and that's a huge element. The Bundesliga, and I want to make sure this is official. Yes, it is. The Bundesliga announced that in the first mass test conducted in the first and second division on Thursday, 10 infections were detected, and that is across all first division clubs, all second division clubs. I'm assuming across staff at those clubs as well. That's a whole lot of people. 10 people were tested positive. The second wave of tests has already started. I believe Cologne had already done that second wave after they had the test. I don't know where the other positive tests were across the pyramid. The league just announced that. And that's something that I did see in Germany. They want all of this to come from the league side as opposed to team by team announcing positive tests, negative tests, et cetera, et cetera. And I get it. That way you can have a better picture of it. 10 across 36 teams and 30 players on a roster probably, and I don't know if this is including academy or junior teams or what have you, but it's a lot of people and it's a small number. It's still 10, and you have to now take the next steps. But this is your test case. This is what other leagues can learn from. Italy needs protocols, right? Well, let's see how this goes down, because if 10 out of however many test positive, and you isolate, you do the contact tracing outside of it, but within your clubs, you isolate, you retest again, you make sure that everything's good, you can show the pathway to dealing with this. Because you've seen teams deal with players get the flu or stomach bugs or anything else that's contagious, and they're separated from the group. This is far more contagious, and you have to be even more careful. But this can give you the pathway to taking whatever internal club protocol you had about dealing with a contagious disease within your group and kick it up to a whole nother level because of this. But Germany is going to give you those protocols. Pay attention.
Twitter to wrap up this morning. Tafka, going back to the discussion about free play, says he'd love to see once a weekend free play with insert pro sign up kind of a thing as a way to grow interest. In all caps, he goes, Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds good, but the real-time logistics are really difficult. Because, okay, let's say Chicago does it. Let's say Jordy Mihailovic is going to show up at a local park and just be there to play. What does that really look like? Because you're going to have a bunch of people there to meet Jordy Mihailovic. He might kick the ball around with some people or whatever. But is it going to actually do the free play element you're looking for? I don't think it does. I think you still need to push it. And this is something Soccer in the Streets would do, these kind of events and find a hybrid. I think the Street Cup model that Jill, the Soccer for Good OG, helped put together is huge. And that was, kind of taken from street football world and modified, and we always found little modifications to it to make it work in different communities. But essentially, it was the idea that, okay, you're going to have, let's say here in Atlanta, you get, if you can get Joseph to come out, or you're going to get Brad Kazan to come out to an event. All right. It's going to be a madhouse, first off. You got to have some programming around it to keep the kids active and to do something until the player gets there, because the player's not going to be there all day. The player's going to be there for an hour, 30 minutes, 2 hours if you're really lucky. You're going to have to take care of them, but you're also going to have to keep everybody active. So the Street Cup model, kids would come and sign up. They didn't have to come in a team. They'd come, they'd sign up, they'd play. We'd divide them into teams. And when we did it, I think in the truest of senses, you'd divide the teams randomly, roughly by ages. So you'd have kids of the same size playing together, and divide them up and create a little schedule, and they'd all get to play games. But the games would not have referees. They'd call their own fouls. You'd have somebody on the side who would step in if needed. But it was structured free play with the emphasis on the free play part of it. You're going to have to do things like that in the short term. Just having a player go out doesn't necessarily create the free play. It's a bonus on top of it. You can create an event that has free play in it and still incorporate a player to help attract people out to do it. But you've got to kind of foster that development of the free play element. The logistics of these kind of things aren't easy, and people like Jill, have done this for a long time, and they have a lot of information to share and give. And every soccer organization, every soccer community can learn from those things and take it and make it work for them to get the most out of it for their group of kids.
Also, Katie Weaver says, did y'all see any of the unfiltered 95 Braves Zoom Game 6 watch-along on Saturday? She caught the last inning, and it was entertaining, like Glav had to warn Merker it was a live broadcast. She says, we need that in 10 to 20 years with the 2018 Atlanta United team watching the MLS Cup final together.
Yeah, that would be cool. I did see some of that. That's what's been one of the cool things about all of this is you're finding some interesting content and ways to present it. It's one thing just to re-air an old game. It's another, like when we do a watch-along, if we're watching a game and talking about it and talking about the history. When you have these elements of, the people involved in it looking back at something, that's a whole nother level. Like, I think at first a lot of people zeroed in on The Last Dance as like, oh, this is an amazing thing because it's got all this footage. And the old-school footage is great. A lot of it is highlights, honestly. I mean, the most powerful things out of it from the old footage, for me, really up until this last episode, was watching old Jordan highlights because, good grief, that guy was a maniac.
Yes.
Especially when he was really young and could just fly. Now, this past one, like you had the clip of them after a game before they got on the bus, sitting with a cigar and a Miller Lite, saying, I think Scottie Pippen said something like, this is all we were thinking about in the fourth quarter. Like, stuff like that's amazing. But for the most part, what's been great about that show has been the old highlights that you could watch in any form you want to. They've been packaged really, really well. But listening to Jordan or Pippen or Ron Harper or Rodman or Phil Jackson look back at it and react to one another's comments about it, that's what's been really cool. So, stuff like the 2018 Atlanta United MLS Cup win and even that whole playoff run, 10 years, 20 years, that would be amazing to have those guys look back at it then. Because right now it's so fresh. Like, I don't know what you'd really get out of it if they did that today. But in time, yeah, it'd be amazing.
Might have to get into this tomorrow, but Tafka has linked to the Sam Stejkal MLS Supporters Survey. Sam got lots of interesting insights, ideas, and critiques from thousands of respondents. Tafka says probably one of the biggest survey and response articles ever, and it didn't hold back in asking questions, inviting fans to really express their feelings about their club, league, and sport. And it's in Sam's queue over at The Athletic.
Okay, we'll dig into that and the details of it tomorrow. That I saw when they were asking people to fill it out, so I don't know what they did outside of Twitter, but I'm going to assume that the overall group of respondents would be highly engaged, very passionate, very hardcore fans. Not necessarily supporters group members, but hardcore fans, people who would listen to us, for example, and not getting casual fans, because I don't know if they would respond to it. So that's one thing to keep in mind with stuff like that, is it is a self-selecting survey. And what I would be curious about with stuff like that, and I think it's something that MLS needs to find a way to survey more effectively, is that casual fan. Is that person who comes out to a game or two a year, that person who isn't ride or die with soccer. Because those are the people that ultimately are going to grow the game. Those are the ones that take it from here to up here in terms of level. That's what's happened here in Atlanta. I think you have more of that than anywhere else. Like, we talked about the ratings numbers when, the Liga MX, MLS, you merge and then everything blows up. Well, I mean, the Liga MX second leg of the final drew, over 3 million. That's great. The MLS Cup final drew just slightly less than 2. Okay, you're not going to just combine the two and now you have 5 million people, because there's overlap. And that's the hardcore of the hardcore. The way you grow it is to get the casual fans' interest. Would a merger between the two leagues get casual fans' interest? Would they care? I don't know. And I don't think we really have any way to know that right now. These surveys are great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to throw shade at it. I'm saying you have to understand who is responding. And I think in the soccer community at times we don't look enough at the casual fan. The one who shows up for the World Cup. It's why the World Cups are important. The one who shows up for the big event. The one who, here in Atlanta, watches a couple games a year on TV, buys tickets to a game or two, or, goes with their workplace or whatever. Just like they would go to a Braves game a couple times a year, just like they go to a Hawks game a couple times a year. Those people are very important in the business side of this as well. I think at times in soccer, we've only focused on the hardcore side, and that's always going to be a more limited number. You have to understand what your casual fan wants too. And it's just hard to find them. It's hard to get them to do that survey. I hope it's something that teams do a little bit more of.
KFC this morning says, I'm enjoying the EMLS tournament special with EMLS and MLS players in FIFA 20. Sean Johnson versus Aaron Long was entertaining. NYRB Amadou found a way to give Long the red card he asked for in a New York derby. And I'm looking forward to Franco and Paulo repping the Five Stripes next week.
Yeah, that's been a fun format. I mean, I've watched some of the esports things, and I like what MLS did with this, to have players play one another, talk a little trash. Also, the EMLS guys play one another and have the aggregate scoring. Like, it's a good format. I hope it's something that they do more of, even when we get back to real games. If this is an off-season thing or whatever, this is a good format. They can do more with it.
And Chris Hutchison passing along in the timeline this morning. Don Shula passed at 90.
Wow. One of the all-time greats, coaches, period.
Mm-hmm.
A coach that won Super Bowls, did it a couple of different places, most known for his time at Miami, but he was a legend with the Colts as well before that. And just one of the all-time great coaches in sport.
90 years of age, Don Shula. But Chris Hutchison admitted it was off topic, but he wanted to pass that along this morning.
Yep. I haven't. I saw that flash across, but I haven't seen details. I don't know if it's related to the virus or not. But these things are coming across a little more frequently than any of us would like. So. They take a hit on everybody. They weigh you down, and really at this stage, all of us can do is try to manage whatever we gotta manage for ourselves. I've definitely over this whole time frame went back and forth between watching a lot of news and watching no news.
Yep.
There's things I want to know and what's going on, and there's also stories like this, stories like others that I'm not really wanting to process at the moment. And, it's not trying to be insensitive. It's just we've all got to take care of ourselves at this point. And there's a lot of this right now. There's a lot of sickness, a lot of death, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. That's why we've all got to work together to get through this. And it's a very important part of just humanity right now. Is whatever walls we've put up to separate ourselves from one another, you got to lower those a little bit right now. We've got to find ways to work together to make this better and to get through it, because we all want to get back to normal. We all want to not be faced with all of this on a daily basis, and we all have our own challenges dealing with it. But we're never going to get through all of it by screaming at one another, by separating ourselves from one another. We've got to literally separate right now, at least in most places. But you can still have some understanding and empathy for others right now. So I hope that can continue to grow. I posted it last week, and I do try to live by this. William Preston Esquire, better known as Bill from Bill and Ted.
There you go.
Be excellent to one another. That's what we got to do right now, y'all, whether it's in soccer or not. So I hope that to tie everything together on a Monday morning, I hope that the U.S. Soccer Federation can be excellent to the women's national team. You won the court case. That's okay. You did. And the judge agreed with the points and the numbers. Hey, they do bear it out. That doesn't mean you need to act like a bad winner here. The Federation shouldn't act like that anyway. The Federation needs to be what it is and be there for the growth of the game and the good of the game. And there are things that they have done in a very bad way towards the women's national team. There are things that should not have ever happened, and they need to repair that relationship. Now is the time where you can move forward. And you need to go ahead and bring them into the table, too, because you're going to be in the same situation with them with their CBA expired. So get these things done, move forward, especially in light of the new challenges that the Federation's going to deal with, soccer as a whole is going to deal with. Get these things nailed down and move in the same direction. Leagues around the world, if we're going to have the situation that England's having now, where you got teams who don't want to finish because they don't want to get relegated, even though you could still pass something to get them relegated if you want to. And you've got others who want to finish, and you've got some who need to finish because they need the money, and you've got others who don't really care. That's going to lead to nothing good. You've got to find ways to work together. You've got to find ways to understand one another, and that's what the game and what society needs right now. So I'm going to listen to Bill from Bill and Ted.
Yes.
I'm not going to party on yet.
No.
Sorry, Ted, and sorry, Keanu. No. I'm going to be excellent to one another as best I can.
Yes. Armando Saguaro from the Miami Herald, cause of death not immediately known. Source has confirmed not related to COVID-19. And Chris Hutchison says he's going to take the dog for a walk after the show. No more news for the next couple of hours for me. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for listening, Chris. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks everybody who has ordered masks. We're going to get an order into Die Hard probably tomorrow. So you want to guarantee yourself a mask, get in on the pre-sale, shoot us a message at Soccer Down Here on Twitter, Soccer Down Here at Gmail, Facebook, Soccer Down Here. That's where we are there. Send us a message. Let us know if you want in. They're $20. You'll get a mask. That includes shipping, so it's just $20 flat. You'll get a mask. You'll get it shipped to you, and a mask will be donated to Soccer in the Streets, to kids and families who might need help in getting a mask. So I think we're going to need masks for a while, and even if it's for our own peace of mind. It is for me. I wear a mask when I go to the grocery store, and I need to go to the grocery store. That's someplace I will be going later today. So I will be putting a mask on. And when I get my soccer in the streets or soccer down here mask, my soccer for good mask, I will be wearing that to the grocery store with my soccer down here hat. And we've had people who have actually requested hats and scarves too. So you can send us a message about that as well. Thank y'all for listening. Thanks for all the interaction. Thanks for all the tweets and messages and so on and so forth. We appreciate it. We'll be back tomorrow. Much plot, y'all.
Much plot, y'all.